this video we're going to look at the risk management process, and this is the risk management process as set out in NZS 31000. Remember the statements here, they establish the context, these things, they correspond with things in PMBOK as well, but it's better to use this one because that's what's probably used in the engineering industry. So this is the risk management process as set out in NZS 31000. So you can see that the middle bits there are planning the risk. So I'm going to talk about these in a bit more detail. Establishing the context is basically setting the rules for the risk management process. These ones here are assessing the risks, so identifying what they are, determining how likely and what the consequences are going to be of them, and then ranking them, sort of saying these ones are totally unacceptable, we've got to do something about it, and these ones are okay, but whatever. So this is ranking them. So identify, get an idea of how serious they are, and then rank them. Now the ones that are totally unacceptable, you need to do something with them. So for example, one of the risks is someone getting hit by an excavator, and obviously the consequences of getting hit by an excavator are quite serious. You can get serious injury or you can die. So one of the things might be people are trained to work around excavators, or and they wear high visibility jackets. So you're reducing the likelihood of it happening because the excavator operator can see the person in the high visibility jacket, and the person in the worker is actually trained to stay outside of the radius of the excavator. And so then you might say, well, that's the risk treatment, we're going to get them to do that, we're going to implement that. So if that's implemented, what are the chances of it happening? And so you're reducing the likelihood of it happening. So we'll look at that in a lot more detail later on. So there is the planning side of things. Once the project is underway, you need to execute it. So it's no use coming up with these things, like you have to wear high visibility jackets. If you're working on site, you need to be trained to work around excavators, unless it's communicated and implemented. In other words, the supervisors, the people that are on site making sure that supervising the workers, actually make sure that everyone's wearing high visibility jackets, that everyone who's working on site knows how to work around an excavator. So you need to communicate it, and you need to make sure that everyone understands it. And then the other thing that happens is monitoring and controlling. So you're also looking at it and saying, are our people working safely around excavators, for example? So it's no use sort of making it happen and then not looking at it and saying, is this actually achieving what we want to achieve? In the case of the high visibility jackets, are the people acting safely around the excavator? And so it's not a matter of just implementing it and then saying it'll be alright. It is implementing it and saying, is it alright, and checking it. So that's what that last one is. Monitoring and controlling risk. And every week you should be looking at the work you're doing and saying, what are the new risks that have come up, and what are we going to do about them? So it's not a matter of just planning it and then doing it. The planning happens all the time. As the project progresses, you're updating that project plan as you go. So let's look at the planning side of them. There's the establish the context, which is in PMBOK it's plan risk management. And in this case here, you're figuring out what are the objectives, what is really important to you, what are the risks that you can compromise on, and what are the ones that you can't compromise on. The acceptability of risk, what type of risk will the client accept, which is what I talked about before. And the assessment process, how are we going to assess the risks? What do we regard as an unacceptable risk, a high level risk? What do we regard as an acceptable risk? So you need to set those rules before you actually start assessing the risks. Then the next one is risk assessment. So these three processes all happen together. Oftentimes they happen in one process, but it's quite useful to split them out and look at them bit by bit. So it's identifying, analysing and evaluating. You're sorting the risks into acceptable and unacceptable, high level risk, low level risk, and there's usually a medium level risk, which is okay, but you need to keep a close eye on it if you like. So risk identification, so that's the first one. you need to brainstorm it. What can happen? How can it happen? What are the events that could happen that could have, and what would the effect be on our project objectives? And so you basically put together a risk register or risk log, which lists them. And right at the start, you brainstorm it. You don't assess them. You don't say, "Oh, that's stupid" or "that's unlikely." You write it down, and then in the next step, we're going to do the analysis and say whether it's unlikely or not. But at present, in this first stage, you're putting everything down. You're brainstorming it. Okay. So this is the risk register, and this is what we're going to fill in as part of our risk management planning. So we've got the risk description. So when we're doing our brainstorming, we would be filling in these risks here. And then in the later ones, as we sort of go on, when we start analysing it, we'll do the likelihood, consequence, and risk treatment, and all that sort of stuff. So this, after the identification, you'll have filled in this column here. So what it does is it takes each risk, and then once we've actually listed all our risks, then we go through and we do our assessment of them, analysis. So how likely are they? What are the consequences of them happening? You know, if they do happen, how serious is it? What objectives is it going to affect, and how seriously? And then the combination of this and this give us the risk level. Is it high, unacceptable, or is it low, acceptable, or medium? Yeah, sort of. We need to do a little bit more work on it. If it is unacceptable, what is the treatment? What are the things we're going to do to try to reduce it to an acceptable level? And then who's responsible for it? So let's look at the next step. So we've started our risk log, we've written down all of our risks, which we identify in the risk identification process. And then we've got to measure it somehow. How do you measure a risk? And it's a function of likelihood and consequence. So likelihood is what are the chances of the event happening, and consequences are how serious is the damage if it does happen. And we do this every day. The reason why you've survived so long is because you do this naturally. This is part of your instincts. When you hop in a car, you put on a safety belt. You're not putting on a safety belt because you intend to crash. You're putting on a safety belt because if you do crash, the likelihood of you being badly injured reduces. Okay, the consequences reduce if you're wearing a safety belt. So you're putting the safety belt on. You don't intend to crash, but if you do, then the consequences of that crash will be less than what they would have been if you weren't wearing a safety belt. When you are going to turn into an intersection, you put on an indicator to tell everyone where you're going. And you're doing that because, well, it's the law, but also you're reducing the likelihood of someone misinterpreting what you're doing and crashing into you. So when you're driving a car, you're doing a whole lot of risk management just naturally. And you do this in everyday life. When you go to cross the road, you look left, you look right before you cross the road. You're reducing the likelihood of getting run over by a car. Okay, so these are things that you probably never thought about before, but it is quite useful to think about it in engineering because the risks are just so much more, and they're probably new to you as well. So the risk analysis is assessing them according to those sort of things. Now there are two different types of risk analysis. Qualitative risk analysis, where it's a description, so you're saying it's a high risk, it's a medium risk, it's a low risk. But you can also do quantitative risk analysis, where you express it as a number, and that sort of gets into the realms of probability and mathematical formulas and all sorts of stuff like that. Now in engineering and for this course, we're just looking at the qualitative one, where we're saying that is unlikely to happen. Whereas if it was a quantitative one, they'd say there's a 1 in 10,000 chance that that would happen. But as I said, we're just going to look at the qualitative risk analysis on this course. So how do you measure it? So remember, we are using the qualitative method rather than the quantitative. We're not using numbers. So we identify, you can identify hundreds of risks when you're sort of really looking at a project straight up. And some will be acceptable, paper cut. Some will be unacceptable, serious injury. So how do we sort them out? How do we measure each risk? And the way we do that is we measure the likelihood, or we estimate the likelihood, which is the chance of the event occurring, and the consequences. If the event happens, what's going to happen? What are the consequences going to be? Is it going to be serious injury, or is it just going to be someone putting a plaster? Now, in NZS 31,000, they've got quite a nice little qualitative measures, if you like. So you can look at the likelihoods and say, you know, the likelihood of this event happening is almost certain it'll happen, okay, or rare, probably won't happen, and you've got all these bits in between, and then the consequences, and you'd be looking at these consequences for each objective. So it might be insignificant or catastrophic. So an insignificant risk consequence might be someone has to get a plaster, so they get a paper cut. A catastrophic one might be someone dies. A major might be someone has to go to hospital. A moderate might be someone has to go visit their doctor. Minor might be they have to go visit the first aid kit, or the first aid officer, or something like that. So you can see that very quickly you can start looking at each one of these events using this really simple system and saying, well, this is almost certainly going to happen, but the consequences are insignificant. So it's not really an unacceptable risk. Or this is, it's possible this could happen and the results would be catastrophic. Now you don't just do this just for the safety, you'd use it for time. Are you going to end up with a catastrophic time overrun, as in it takes a couple of years as opposed to a couple of months, or an insignificant time overrun, which is maybe a few days. So once again, you could apply that to time, to cost. Insignificant might be a few dollars, catastrophic might be a few $1,000,000. And so each one of those objectives, you can apply these consequences to them as well. So putting it all together, we would go through our sheet and we would sort of estimate the likelihood of each of those events that we've identified happening, and the consequences as well. And then we look at each one of those and we say, well, what is acceptable and what is unacceptable? So that's what happens in this risk evaluation process. So risk evaluation is identifying the level of the risk. Now, once again, NZS 31,000 provides a really nice little chart. Now, right at the start, when we're doing establishing the context, we would have come up with this table here. So we'd say that if something's almost certain, but it's it doesn't seem right. It's almost certain, but it's an insignificant consequence, we're going to call it a moderate risk. Could be acceptable, but we need to monitor it. If it's possible and it's an insignificant risk, then it's acceptable. On the other side, if it's unlikely but there's a major consequence, then we might say moderate. Now you might look at that and say, well, if we're looking at, say, safety, we might say, well, even if it's unlikely but there's a major consequence, we might say that that's a high risk, unacceptable, we need to do something about it. So you can change this table around as you like. These are just put in here as a bit of an example. It's just a way of sorting it. You've got hundreds of risks. How do you sort out the ones that you need to spend your time and resources on to manage? And so they would be those ones in that high risk category, and probably in the moderate risk category as well. So once again, you look at those ones that are unacceptable and you plan your risk response, if you like. So there's the PMBOK statement for it. So you develop options to enhance the opportunities and reduce the threats. So you increase the you decrease the likelihood of bad things happening, you increase the likelihood of good things happening. And usually it's one person set to develop it. So you might look at a risk of what we talked about before, someone getting hit by an excavator. So you'd look at that and say, well, how can we reduce the likelihood? Well, we reduce everyone in high-vis jackets and we train them properly. So that's what happens in that risk treatment thing. And then you go through again and say, well, if someone's wearing a high-vis jacket and they're properly trained, then the chances of it happening are probably reduced down to unlikely. So is that an acceptable risk or not? So that's what you're doing in that risk treatment, is you're looking at those risks and you're trying to reduce down the chance of them happening. And what you're ending up with is a to-do list. These are the things that need to happen on site. One of them would be everyone has to wear high-vis jackets. Everyone has to be trained to work around excavators. So that's a to-do list, and the person responsible has to make sure that those things actually happen. It's no use having this nice risk plan and nothing is actually being implemented. That part there where you communicate and consult is the important part. This is just a whole lot of papers. This is where you make sure it happens, and this is where you make sure that it's actually doing what it's supposed to do, that it is actually working. So the risk treatment is, you decide on risk treatment, you assess the residual risk. So if everyone's wearing jackets and they're trained to work around excavators, what's the risk going to be, residual risk, after you've done the risk treatment. Is it acceptable or not? Yes, you document it. In other words, you put it in your risk register, and you make sure it happens on site. Everyone wears the vests, everyone's trained. No, then you might come up with some more options. So you might say, when the excavator's working in this particular area here, we're going to put fences around it, so no one is allowed in that particular area, even if they're trained or not, or even if they're wearing high-vis jackets. Does that make it more acceptable or not? So that is what we're doing with this threat treatment. And so the different ways of doing it are: avoid it, do not carry out the activity. So for example, if you are doing pipe work, laying pipelines, and you identify a risk of the trench collapsing in on people, one way of preventing it from happening, avoiding it altogether, is using directional drilling. So now you don't have to actually dig a trench, you've actually removed the threat altogether. Another one is to reduce or mitigate. So you reduce the likelihood of the risk. In other words, you might sort of have it that that you put shoring into the trench. The risk is still there, but it's the likelihood of someone getting trapped is much less than what it would have been otherwise. Other risks, such as an accident causing significant financial harm to the um, client or to the contractor, could be transferred. In other words, you insure. So you'll see that most construction contracts require the contractor to ensure the contract works. So if it burns down, there's a risk that the contractor could sort of go broke. So what you do is you get him to insure the works, so that if it does burn down, then someone else is paying for it. You've transferred the risk. Or you retain, you accept it. So low level risks, you accept them. Medium to high level threats, by informed decision. So there's some things that are just absolutely, there's not much, you do as much as you possibly can and it still would be regarded as high level risk. For example, tunnelling. Whatever you do, and they take all sorts of precautions, tunnelling is still a hazardous occupation. You'll take every step you can to make it safe, but tunnelling, mining is still going to be quite dangerous. And so it's accepted by informed decision, and that is very much the least favoured option. That is only what you do as the last recourse. In fact, you would consider very carefully whether you're going to carry out that activity or not, if you have to retain it. And lastly, just looking at opportunities, exploit it. So you take the action to ensure that opportunities are captured. So early completion bonus. So they might say, if you finish early, we're going to pay you extra money. So you use your best workers and you resource it all up. You work with another organisation to share it, so you've got a better chance of, say, winning a contract. You enhance it to increase the likelihood of. So you buy equipment that'll help you win that contract, or you accept it. You just don't take any specific action. If it happens, that's really great, but you're not sort of doing anything special to try to do it. So as I said, monitoring and review, you do need to sort of make sure that the risk actions, the risk treatments you've got are effective. So when the project is underway, you're always reviewing it. You're reviewing whether there are new risks as well, and you're sort of undergoing risk treatment. So the risk management process, the risk planning happens right through the whole project. That risk register is being updated and reviewed every week. And the last thing, communication and review. We communicate with everyone. We make sure that everyone understands what we're doing. And then the last thing to look at is you need to audit it. You need to do looking at the risks all the time. Are there new risks? Have the old risks become more risky? Have formerly risky and higher level risks become less risky? Are the trigger events going to occur or not? So you need to be considering that as well. So it's quite a process, and we're sort of going to go through this in class, and hopefully you'll get a better understanding of how this process works.